Over the course of a few years, I interviewed close to 100 people and came up with this podcast where we try to tell this story about the Catholic Church and what it did during the HIV and AIDS crisis. And especially in New York here, the two communities, the gay community and the Catholic community, were very linked during this time. They were kind of forced to be together. And that's what we explore, like, why did that happen?
What does it take to get a more in-depth look into the week's top local news story? The Debrief brings you inside for a one-on-one conversation with our reporters. Every week, right here, right now. The Debrief. Recently, both New York State and New York City announced that a significant milestone had been reached when it comes to HIV and AIDS, that there were fewer diagnoses, both at the state level and in New York City. More people are getting treated, and the treatment is more successful. But we realize that there's probably a generation of folks now in their 20s, maybe 30s, who have no idea how difficult it was for HIV and AIDS patients when the illness first emerged on the public scene. So we spotted a podcast, and we said, we gotta know more. It's from Michael O'Loughlin, who's a writer with American Magazine, and it's called Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church. Michael, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
So many things to unpack here, but first, just tell our listeners and our viewers on YouTube and elsewhere a little bit about American Magazine.
Sure. America is a magazine run by the Jesuits, so it's a Catholic magazine. We cover the Catholic Church and what's going on in the world. We produce a series of podcasts, videos, and a print magazine that comes out bi-weekly.
Right. So on the Debrief, we like to do things that usually have a nexus to New York City and the tri-state, and of course, this crisis does, but also some of the things that you've highlighted. For example, Cardinal John O'Connor, who was leading the Archdiocese at the time AIDS entered the public mindset. And I don't want to dig into all of it, but start broadly. You've been working on this a few years. What made you want to tell these stories?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of investigate what was happening at the time between the Catholic Church and people living with HIV and AIDS, because I write a lot about LGBT issues today, because there's a lot going on in terms of religion and LGBT issues. And I started thinking, this feels fresh because it's news and happening today, but surely this isn't the first time people lived through some of these challenges. So I started reaching out to people who were, living and working on the front lines of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, sort of to consider, what was it like to try to live as an LGBT person and reconcile that with your Catholic faith when there's some tension there. And that's when I started realizing there's a lot of stuff there that I didn't know. I'm in my 30s, and this is kind of history that hasn't been passed on to me. So over the course of a few years, I interviewed close to 100 people and came up with this podcast where we try to tell this story about the Catholic Church and what it did during the HIV and AIDS crisis. And especially in New York here, the two communities, the gay community and the Catholic community, were very linked during this time. They were kind of forced to be together. And that's what we explore, like, why did that happen?
I'm Michael O'Loughlin from America Media, and this is Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church.
It's mysterious, it's deadly, and it's baffling medical science.
As someone who's gay and Catholic, I'm always curious how others manage this sometimes complex identity. No time in modern history was more volatile for gay Catholics than at the height of the AIDS epidemic.
This is Jesus Christ. I'm in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Sunday. Inside, Cardinal O'Connor is busy spreading his lies and rumors about the position of lesbians and gays. We're here to say we want to go to heaven too.
So interesting. So your point, well taken. You have issues today where gay teachers, for example, are fired from their positions in Catholic schools. Other employees are fired today. The U.S. Conference of Bishops, many bishops around the world, can't seem to get on the same page when it comes to outreach and dialogue with the LGBT community. And that made you want to say, look back in history, because this tension has been here before.
Exactly. And I'm a gay Catholic myself, so I've been reporting on this and simultaneously living it. So I'm kind of like curious, like, what did people who have a couple decades on me, like, what did they learn during this time that I don't know yet? So it's kind of like reaching out to those who came before me to what's their insight and wisdom that I can sit with today and think about.
So Michael, you talked to some of the people who are on the front lines. Give us a couple of examples of who you talked to and what they told you back in the 80s, about the 80s.
So in the first episode, the podcast, we meet a guy named David Pace. And David is sort of an early member of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was formed here in New York to provide education about HIV and AIDS. And David's also been a practicing Catholic most of his life. And he talks about how his early activism was sort of motivated by his faith. He saw in his Catholic faith like a call to go out and serve those in need. And he saw in the gay community, which he's a part of, that there was a lot of need at this time. So he is an interesting story because he's an early member of one of the most prominent HIV and AIDS organizations in New York. And he also grapples with how can I stay Catholic when I feel like I'm being attacked from the church.
It took me some time to realize that I'm as Catholic as the Pope, and that my baptismal consecration made me as legitimate a Catholic as anybody else. And nobody's kicking me out of my house. I'm going to stay, I'm going to fight, I'm going to make it a safer place for all of God's people.
So his story has a lot of twists and turns. He kind of steps away from his faith for a while, steps away from AIDS ministry after losing a lot of friends, losing his partner, but kind of comes back to it. He feels like that's where he's called to be. So we meet him today. He's still working at GMHC. He's very involved in his parish here in New York. And he's kind of the guide who sets the scene for what we're trying to do with the podcast.
You paint a little bit of the picture that you do in the podcast for listeners, perhaps hopefully younger listeners who don't know, what the climate was like in the nation at the time, the Reagan administration, and how it was confronting this AIDS crisis. And then New York City, what was happening here, and then it included and enveloped the Cardinal Archbishop John O'Connor. Paint that picture a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So in New York, you had a large gay community, obviously, and especially in the 80s, you had a large and powerful Catholic network that included a lot of hospitals and healthcare. And that's why the communities are kind of forced to come together. We profile in the second episode the former St. Vincent's Hospital down in Greenwich Village, which kind of became synonymous with HIV and AIDS care in the 80s and 90s. What's fascinating about that is you had the cardinal sort of saying like, yes, let's be in this space providing care to people, but it wasn't a natural fit right away. So you had groups like ACT UP, a big protest group, sort of protesting the hospital early on because they felt that gay patients there weren't receiving the proper care and respect that they deserved. But then you had the Catholic Sisters of Charity of New York who ran it, saying like, let's listen to this group. Like, why are they angry? What can we learn to do better?
We were a Catholic hospital under the auspices of perhaps the most conservative archbishop in the country, Cardinal John O'Connor. So he's a very compassionate man, very orthodox, very true to what the Catholic Church teaches. And sometimes there were rubs of varying degrees between those two audiences, if you will, or players. And I was like the director with the baton, you know, like, how do we do this in this place at this time?
And eventually, through a series of meetings and trainings, St. Vincent's becomes sort of the place for HIV and AIDS care in New York. So it's that sort of like quieter stories that we're trying to figure out. Like we interview some of the sisters who lived through it and made the decision to transform the hospital into a place that could provide the kind of care they need. And we interview doctors who were there working kind of within the limits that the Catholic Church placed on what they could do. So there's a lot of stories that weren't maybe in the news as much back in the 80s and 90s, but we want to capture them today while people are still able to tell them.
And that's the point, isn't it, Michael? The headlines were dominated by what the cardinal was saying against homosexuality and the
Exactly.
teachings of the church and no condom distribution. But yet, he himself was trying to learn more and treat. Talk about that, because at least one person I talked to said I had no idea. I'd kind of heard it, but now I think you're putting a face to his private feelings and how he interacted with AIDS patients.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, he says that he was an archbishop and he had to sort of preach the church's line on homosexuality and on condoms at the time. But in private, he says he visited more than 1,000 people with AIDS over the course of a number of years. He would visit St. Clair's Hospital in Hell's Kitchen, St. Vincent's, and always away from the limelight. The people I talked to who worked at these hospitals said he would come at night, no cameras would be there, he'd be dressed as a regular priest, he wouldn't tell the patients who he was. So there was clearly a struggle going on, I think, between the public line he had to, what he had to preach in public and his private actions around this. And I think what I like about his story is, I think it's emblematic of society as a whole. There was a lot of complexity, a lot of fear, uncertainty, but he tried to, I think, learn as much as he could from this community that was suffering at the time.
I feel like you got to the pathos of gay Catholics and their struggle with wanting to be devout to their faith, and yet being shut out, alienated in such a dramatic way. I actually moderated a panel that kind of talked with that, and I'll never forget how emotional people, some of them have long left the church, and yet were weeping because they missed it in a way. So part of them. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Especially like David, for example, he says that he's Catholic and he's gay, and like neither is up for debate. He's going to own both of those identities, but he's had a hard time in the past kind of figuring out a space for him.
When I was a member of Dignity, and when we were asked to leave this parish, I felt like I was being thrown out of my home, and I had just lost my lover. So it was like a double whammy. It was always kind of a fear, from childhood, of people discovering who you are and rejecting you. And that's what it felt like.
And that's what we see a lot. Like there was a lot of tension with gay groups being kicked out of parishes in New York. But eventually some Catholics find their way back and sort of integrate into parishes today. And it's a tension that has been around for a long time, and it's still today an issue, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to explore
I want you to talk about more about that. How has it changed, and how hasn't it changed then?
Yeah, I asked a lot of people, is it better today or is it worse today? Obviously, society is a bit better for LGBT people.
Overall, right.
And a lot of them said it's actually worse today because the church has maybe reacted strongly against these advances in society, and that people who get married who work in the church might lose their jobs today. They might not feel welcome. But at the same time, we also, find parishes that are welcoming places for LGBT people today. So it's still very much a tension. While society seems to be moving in one direction, the church might still be having this debate inside about what's the proper way to respond to this issue.
Give me another sense of another story that struck you over the 3 years that you've been working on this, an untold story. Just give us a highlight.
Sure, yeah. There's an episode in which I profile a parish in San Francisco, a Catholic church right in the middle of the Castro, the gay neighborhood out there, that really transformed itself into being sort of a meeting space for the gay community and providing like home care to people who were sick at home at a time when a lot of organizations still weren't sure what to do. And there's these great stories of these like old Italian church ladies who were kind of diving into this ministry and weren't afraid, and there was so much fear around, so that they're remarkable that they were able to overcome that sense of fear and just do what had to be done.
We also like to ask reporters when they visit, give us some of the backstory, the reportage, what they had to do to get the stories. I find that you're straightforward. I'm gay, I'm Catholic. This question, do you ever have to confront? Some say, well, that means you bring a certain degree of empathy to the subject matter. Would critics say you bring bias to the subject matter? How do you reconcile that when you're reporting and telling the story?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think being aware of the bias I bring and making sure that I'm including a range of voices. So even the podcast, for example, this is being produced by a Catholic magazine, but we include critics. I mean, I interview people who were in ACT UP, interview people who left the church and said that, what they did was wrong at the time. And that's what I bring to my reporting, just making sure that I serve my readers well by including a range of voices and trusting them enough to make their own decisions. I don't have to tell them what to think.
It's fascinating, well worth a listen. And I would also direct folks to our website, because we just recently did a study of Catholic workers around the Catholic who work in diocese and their thoughts and their input about where things stand. Our I-team with Chris Glorioso did that. So really good story, but this is really New York history, and that's why we liked it so much. Michael, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm your host, David Ushery. We want to thank our producers, Jesse Edwards and Ben Berkowitz from the digital team. Check you next time. Good evening.